Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering a little bit of history about the Mauretania ship, arguably one of the most well-known ships built at Wallsend. I hope you will enjoy it and find it interesting. It would seem that in the late 1800s a ship's speed was something that made them successful, and after being the owners of the fastest ships at sea for several years, the Cunard Line found themselves falling behind to a new German ship. This, along with the White Star Line beginning to move up in the speed stakes, the Cunard Line wanted to regain control. And this led to an agreement with the government in around 1902 to build two superliners with a speed of 24 knots. The two ships would be the Mauretania and her sister ship, the Lusitania. Swan Hunters won the fight to build the Mauretania. However, it was not until 1904 that work would finally begin, due to the Cunard Line changing their plans several times. Swan Hunters built a shed to house the ship while she was not in the water, and this led to the discovery of a little more of the Roman wall, the end of which was mentioned with a plaque in Swan Hunters shipyards for many years after the ship was built, and the end of the wall itself, however, was taken bit by bit to Wallsend Park, where it was rebuilt and put on display. It was later moved to the Hall grounds. Now, it does make me wonder just how much of the original wall was left after they had moved it around a few times. Of course, these days it's back in Segedunum, although it's not as easy to spot as it doesn't look quite the same as it did when it was in the park. The Mauretania was launched in September of 1906, and the news reports of the time class it as a magnificent spectacle. The glide into the water was accompanied by cheers, the clash of hammers, and the sound of many ship sirens on the Tyne. They estimated that crowds upwards of 200,000 had turned out to see the Duchess of Roxburgh launch the ship, with hundreds of small boats on the river and the people lined on the banks of each side of the Tyne. It has to be said that many ship launches had already taken place and many more were to come, but I have never heard of another that created such interest in the area. A lunch was held after the launch, and Sir William White, who had been a consultant architect on the Mauretania, said he believed she could easily achieve some impressive speeds, and indeed he would turn out to be correct. William Watson, who was the chairman of the Cunard Shipping Company, said he believed the ship would achieve great success, and he then presented the Duchess of Roxburgh with a silver basket, which was engraved with the Mauretania and the crest of Wallsend and the Roxburgh family. Lord Tweedmouth said that these ships, meaning both the Mauretania and her sister ship, were a sign of the future, where turbine engines were going to be the new power force of shipping. He said he hoped they would never be needed for anything other than passenger service. Sadly, this would be something that did happen during World War I, where Mauretania did see active service. Sir J.B. Hunter then read out several telegrams congratulating Swan Hunters on the building of such a fine ship, and some discussion was then held as to how Wallsend had grown from a mining town into a great industrial centre, stating that Wallsend was likely to be ranked first in shipbuilding output for the year of 1906. Around a year later, in September of 1907, the Mauretania took to the sea for the first time, and it was said that for her trials, which would last for 3 days, she would be under the charge of South Shields pilot Mr. Thomas Young. Again, it was said that the banks of the Tyne, this time from Wallsend to Tynemouth, were lined with thousands of people wanting to see the ship leave her place of birth. The trip from Swan Hunters to the sea was said to take an hour as she travelled down at a rate of 3 miles per hour. And it was said that as soon as she passed the piers at Tynemouth, the crowd watching gave a huge cheer. Her trials would see her travelling as far as Scotland and down to Flamborough Head. On Saturday, November the 16th, 1907, Mauretania set sail on her maiden voyage to New York. She left Liverpool fully booked. She was able to carry over 2,000 passengers under the watchful eye of Captain John Pritchard. Captain Pritchard, who was born in North Wales and had been to Wallsend in the past, had been orphaned at a young age, and his mother's last wish had been for him to take up the life of a sailor, and this he seemed to really enjoy, rising through the ranks of shipping to become an accomplished captain. It was hoped that Mauretania's maiden voyage would lead to her beating the records of her sister ship, the Lusitania. She had also been well insured for her first journey, for what by today's standards would seem like a fortune. In total, her insurance was almost £1 million, and in today's money, if my calculator is correct, this would be over £153 million. A bit like the Titanic, I'm sure that many people wanted to take a trip on the maiden voyage of the Mauretania, and of course with this being prior to the Titanic disaster, it's unlikely that anyone would have had any fears of travelling to America on this brand new ship. Sadly, the records Mauretania hoped to beat were not to be. The weather played a huge part in this, as it was stated that stormy weather and heavy fog had slowed her down a lot. On arrival at New York, the journey had taken 5 days, 5 hours and 10 minutes to complete. Captain Pritchard said the engines had run smoothly, and passengers on board said they had experienced no discomfort despite the terrible weather the ship had endured. It would take until 1909 for the Mauretania to finally break the Atlantic crossing time, still under the watchful eye of Captain Pritchard, who was by then 63 years old. The Mauretania held the record until 1929, when she was beaten by the German liner Bremen on her maiden voyage. At the outbreak of World War I, Mauretania was mid-Atlantic and she made a dash to safety in Canadian waters. However, the British government requested her service for the war. She proved to be of no use for this, as her size and fuel consumption made her unsuitable for the job, so she became, for a time, a civilian ship again. But with the lack of passengers, she was soon out of service and docked at Liverpool. She would later have several uses during the war. She became a troop ship for a time, and then later became a hospital ship, where she was painted white with a red cross on her side. And later she again became a troop ship, transporting servicemen, first from Canada and then from America. And as a troop ship, she was painted in what was known as dazzle camouflage, which in my opinion made her look like a giant floating chessboard. Luckily for the Mauretania, she did not suffer the same fate as her sister ship, the Lusitania. The Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat almost at the start of the war in 1915, with a loss of 1,197 lives, and she was at the time still in use as a passenger liner. After the war, Mauretania continued in service until 1935. She had several refits, including one at Wallsend in 1921, when her boilers were converted from coal to oil. She had a long and varied life, becoming a dedicated cruise ship in the 1930s, when she was again painted white. She was a popular ship, and many people still wanted to travel on her. However, when the Cunard Line merged with the White Star Line in 1834, Mauretania, along with several other old ocean-going liners, were deemed surplus to requirements and were withdrawn from service. The news that she would be scrapped was finally confirmed in April of 1935, when the papers reported that it had been known for some time that the Mauretania's service life was over, and now it was very saddened to report that she was to travel from Southampton to Glasgow on her final journey to the breakers' yard. In May of 1935, her fixtures and fittings were put up for auction, some of which were acquired by Sir J.B. Hunter, and the ship's bell is in London, and some of the fixtures were installed in a bar in Bristol, then known as the Mauretania Bar. Don't know if that is still there or not. Some of her fixtures and fittings even ended up at Pinewood Studios. In July of 1907, she set sail for the final time, passing several ports along the way. It was said that as she passed, many ships at sea had their flags flying at half-mast. And on reaching the Tyne and the place of her birth, she lay off Tynemouth Pier for half an hour. The mayor of Newcastle went on board for a final visit, and prior to his visit, a message was received, a zip from the ship herself. It read as follows: To the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress and all Tyneside folk, Newcastle upon Tyne, thank you for your greeting. For 28 years I have striven to be a credit to you, and now my day is done. Though I may pass on, may Tyneside ever reach out to further and greater triumphs. With pride and affection I greet you. Farewell, Mauretania. I have to admit to finding the message from the ship to the place she was built quite emotional, perhaps a little bit silly, and I cannot actually explain why. But anyway, Mauretania finally reached Glasgow and the Firth of Forth on the 3rd of July. Although moored away from land at first, the sound of sirens of the ships around greeted her arrival. And among those on board was Mr. Jim Thompson of Wallsend, who had assisted at her launch. A final message from the ship was sent out by Mr. Walter Martin, who had been a chief purchaser at the recent sale of fixtures and fittings. In a message to Sir Arthur Rostron, he stated, For the grand old lady of the sea to have been allowed to pass along to the knacker's yard is to my mind a national disgrace. And as a Wallsend lass proud of that great ship, I am inclined to agree with him. After 28 years of service on the sea, the life of the Mauretania was over. The original ship was replaced by another of the same name in 1939, but for most Wallsenders, the first ship will always be the best, and our only real reminder of her now is the Mauretania pub in Howden. I hope that you have found this short little video about the history of one of our most famous Wallsend ships interesting, and I hope that you have enjoyed it too. I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do look forward to seeing you all again next week.